everybody. This is Ayo Magwood of Uprooting Inequity, and I teach both about content on the history and economics and psychology of racism, more in-depth structural emphasis rather than individual bias. And I also teach educators how to teach about racism in the classroom. So this is my training on educator strategies for addressing race, racism, and inequity in the classroom. It's an elementary school version. So I'm going to say upright that I am not an elementary school teacher, and also I'm not in your classrooms. And of course, there's different standards in different states and different schools, and you teach different subjects possibly, and you're on different grade levels, and you have individual styles. So I'm not going to tell you exactly what to teach. I can't do that that's going to differ from person to person. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some principles and some lenses through which you can figure out some specific classroom activities. Hopefully at the end, there'll be enough time to brainstorm a little bit, and you can run some things by me. And you're also welcome to email me afterwards. I'll share my email address with you, and you can run your ideas by me, and I can help you with that. Okay, so these are the lenses and principles I have this for. So one is I strongly recommend an emphasis on structural racism rather than individual racism. I recommend that you distinguish between empirical versus policy questions about racism. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And in order for them to understand structural racism and to address those empirical structural racism, then you're going to have to teach a little bit about the history or economics of it. I'm using that very broadly. Don't worry, I don't mean for you to teach kindergartners economics, but that's where the direction should be when and if possible. And finally, I'm going to show you how to foster perspectives, consciousness, cultural worldview among the kids. Okay. So that's my outline for today. So first, let's talk about structural versus individual racism. You can think of racism as an iceberg. So at the top, on the tip of the iceberg, peeking outside visible outside the water is intentional explicit bias. Right underneath the surface is implicit bias. But underneath the bottom of that iceberg are systems of racial and economic inequity. So that at the top, we call that individual racism or bias or prejudice. But they're really being fed by these systems of racial economic inequity. So the structural racism is all of it, but definitely including that bottom part, which is a lot of social scientists would argue is by far the biggest part. It's really hard to address bias by itself, because bias is normal. I didn't say it was good, but it was normal. So bias is it evolved during prehistoric times, during caveman times. It was helpful. So those of us who distrusted and suspected and thought bad things about the other tribes and stuck to their own tribe, they were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. And so that's why we have evolved with that bias. It's universal. Every single person has that bias, and it's pretty instinctual. It's very hard to get rid of. But lots of times it's actually the societal factors like economic incentives and politicians that whip up that bias and direct it. Like, how do we know to have bias against one group and not the other? It's often our culture, and that culture is being driven often by economic and political factors underneath. So you can't really, it's pretty hard to get rid of bias just by bias awareness workshops or bias in the classroom. First of all, because it's so ingrained. And second of all, you can't address it in isolation because it's really being driven by societal factors. So that is one. So for example, the George Floyd uprising, this is one current event, right? That but you can't address that. You can't talk about that and consider that current issue in isolation, because it comes from a lot of historical, it's based on, it's really the tip of the iceberg, but underneath the iceberg, there's all these historical and economic factors, economic and political factors that led up to it and driving it. And so if you only look at that tip of the iceberg, you're missing the roots of it. That gives you a hint. That's why my organization is called Uprooting Inequity, because I focus on the root causes. Okay, so if we go back to this individual versus structural racism thing, unfortunately in our schools, we are often seeing the top part. Most educators and schools focus on intentional, on this explicit or implicit bias. But I believe that it's really the school's primary responsibility to address, to teach students about that history of racism and its impact on today. Those empirical questions, I'll tell you more about that structural racism. They can learn about bias. They'll have many, many opportunities to learn about bias outside the classroom. But this is really, in school, is probably their last opportunity to learn about history and economics and maps. And I think it is really our responsibility to teach about that. And it's also more in line with our academic curriculums. So I want to talk about individualism for a little bit, okay? And the role of individual. I just distinguish between individual racism and structural racism, right? So I want to talk a little bit about why we have so much emphasis on individual racism. It's not a coincidence, okay? Part of it has to do with our deep-rooted cultural values about individualism. So in just about any index you can find on individualism, here's just one. This is the Hofstede Cultural Dimensions. We always come out with the strongest levels of individualism out of any other country. We're really a statistical outlier when it comes to on the world level with respect to individualism. Individualism is a huge, very strong take. So what exactly, if we have this individualism culture, what does that mean? It means that we see the self as independent rather than interdependent. We have this I consciousness rather than a we consciousness, and we prioritize self-interest. And we believe that success is determined principally by individual forces rather than by societal forces or luck. Obviously, it's a combination of that, but we tend to focus very exclusively on the individual forces. And we often believe that when someone is poor, it is struggling, is his or her own fault. And we have preferences in this country for less redistribution and lower public spending. We have far fewer distribution and public programs than any of the other counterparts in the world, all the other wealthy countries, Europe, Australia, etc. And historians and economists believe that this culture of rugged individualism is rooted in our history of a frontier settlement. All countries with a strong history of frontier settlements tend to have this rugged individualism, but we had possibly the most frontier settlement, and so that's why we have this rugged individualism. But they also, pretty much all the historians and economists also point out that the second reason is because it is exacerbated by racial animus and the fear that redistribution favors quote unquote undeserving racial minorities. So a lot of social scientists attribute the reason that we have less social programs, like we don't have free school, university education, tuition, and health insurance, et cetera. They attribute that to our history of racial animus. And also, of course, Republican politicians have often whipped that up, right? That's been intentional. There's been an intentional effort to try to make us think, make us associate social programs with racial minorities. So again, so our success and outcome and also racial economic inequities are a product of 4 factors. So on the one hand, there's talent and intelligence. On the other hand, there's effort, or practice, and both of those are within our individual control. But obviously, societal privileges and inequities also play a role, and also just random luck plays a huge role, right? So these are factors outside our individual control. But we in the United States, or any individualistic culture, is going to focus primarily on or exclusively on the factors within individual and want to refuse to recognize the others, both good success and lack of success. So this affects how we acknowledge racial and economic inequity. Like in this country, we don't even want to forget addressing racial and economic inequity. We don't even want to acknowledge it. And this leads, because this individualism leads to a belief that racial disparities do so leads to the lack of individual effort on the back part of Blacks, or that racism is due solely to the attitudes and behaviors of individual racists. So this emphasis on individual prejudice versus societal racism. And there's this, it also leads to vast misperceptions about the degree of economic inequality, economic mobility, racial disparities, and racial progress since the 1960s. I'll show you just a little bit. And it also leads to this really strong need to see our history and nation as good and perfect, and this unwillingness to acknowledge anything bad, quote unquote, bad or negative, including our history of racial discrimination and exploitation. You can see across the country, there's this pushback to even discussing the role of race, slavery and racism in schools. For example, the 1619 Project and the quote unquote critical race theory today. We want to think of our history as perfect. And if you suggest that their history is a combination of good and bad, a lot of people feel that almost personally, like you're personally insulting them. It's not like our history is imperfect, but that you are personally insulting them as an American, how dare you suggest that our history was less than perfect. And it also leads to this unwillingness to take collective responsibility for our history of racial discrimination and exploitation. So there's this, like other countries, for instance, Germany, South Africa, have said, yes, we did this thing, we're not proud of it, and we apologize. So just about every other country that's had a major historical tragedy, such as genocide or slavery, has apologized for it, but we do not want to apologize for it, and we definitely don't want to do anything about it, like reparations or affirmative action, because we feel it's not my fault. I shouldn't have to pay for taxes. I shouldn't have to apologize because I personally did not enslave humans. But in Japan, the vast majority of people didn't use the services of comfort women, of the Korean comfort women in the war, but they still, that in other countries it's easier for them to wrap their head around the idea of collective responsibility, even though I did not individually do that thing. I was against the Holocaust, or my family was against the Holocaust, but it's easier to feel a sense of collective responsibility, that we really, really resist that in the United States because of that individualism. And this is showing, this is an example of what I told you are how we don't like redistribution. So this is the Gini coefficient for most of the OECD, all the European and wealth and United States, Canada, the wealthy countries. So it's a common measure of income inequality. So there's two bars. The top bar is inequality after taxes and transfers, the blue bar, and the pink bar or dark red bar is income inequality before taxes and transfers. So we're at the very top. And so you can see that before taxes and transfers, we have about the same level of economic inequality as all the other countries. But the huge difference is that blue bar. The blue bar is inequality after taxes and transfers. It's just about all the other countries besides us, or they do it a lot more than us. They're willing to do some redistribution in order to make their society more relatively more equal. Not none of these are socialist countries, so it's not a complete equality, of course, but they're willing to take the edges off to make it relatively more equal. And you can see that we really resist that. We really resist redistribution. As I mentioned, I'm just showing you there we are at the top. And here's another example. Remember, I told you that our individualism leads us to these vast misperceptions about we vastly overestimate the amount of mobility, rags to riches, the American dream, equal opportunity, the ability to get ahead if we work hard. We vastly overestimate that. I don't want to barrage you with data. I'm a data nerd and I tend to do that, but I'm just going to show you one like it's very specific with racism. Again, we vastly overestimate the degree to which racial economic disparities have improved since the 1960s. We think it's gotten so much better. So here is a survey that they did in 2016. They asked if the typical white family had 100 units of wealth, how much would the typical Black family have? So they did the survey in 2016, and they also asked the respondents to guess what the answer to the question would have been every 10 years going back to 1963. 1963, of course, being the year before the Civil Rights Movement. I'm sorry, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So the top line is survey responses. So they believed in 2016, they believed that Blacks, the typical Black family would have 90% of white wealth. That is way off the reality. In reality, Blacks, the typical Black family has 10% of wealth of the typical white family. So huge misperception. And you notice there's two vast misperceptions. So on one hand, they have most Americans vastly underestimate the Black-white wealth gap, but also they're vastly overestimating the amount of racial progress since the 1960s. There's this huge myth that the Civil Rights Act ended racism. We're now in a post-racial society. So this very strong desire to see, again, our history as good and as racial inequity as thing of the past. Okay, so that is how that's how individualism affects the way we acknowledge racial and economic equity. But it also, and this is getting closer to where we are, or what you need to know, is it also affects the way we address racial and economic inequity. So we, again, educators and schools and corporations and businesses and organizations and societies, there's a huge emphasis on individual bias and prejudice. And it's because of our culture of individualism. And this is increased further still. And there wasn't even always so, even in our own country. So in the interwar period, racism was less considered individual sin than a product of a society whose political and economic systems were inherently unequal, an emphasis on structural causes. But by the end of World War II, this view was being eclipsed by a theory that Lee Gordon identifies as racial individualism, which presented individual prejudice and discrimination as the root cause of racial conflict, and suggested that racial justice could be achieved by changing white minds and protecting African American rights. American social scientists went from explaining racial inequality in structural terms to targeting individual attitudes and acts of discrimination. The belief that you could get rid of racism by reducing white prejudice. So I did a quick Google search, and I Googled racism cloud, what's it called, thought cloud. And so you can see most of especially the bigger words, are all individual based. So like a big emphasis on bias and stereotypes and intolerance, hatred, bigotry. You notice I don't know if you could tell, but the emphasis on structural and societal are much smaller. People don't really think of that as much. Narrow-minded, right? This is what it should look like. We should be focusing on, when we say racism, we want people to think more about the structural things at the bottom of the iceberg. And this is, and I'm not trying to argue that we should all be non-Americans, right? I just want a gentle reminder that our founding principles, back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and are all rooted in both individual rights and the common good. It's just that we sort of forget about that common good part. And so on one hand, yes, our foundational and constitutional values and principles of individual rights is grounded in natural rights philosophy, Locke and Hobbes, but also it is equally just as much based on our founding on common good, which is grounded in classical republicanism, Plato. That is just as much a part of our founding principles, and people tend to forget about it, or maybe conveniently. So again, this is your job. This is what I was trying to explain. Took a long time to explain that as educators of future adults, as future residents of the United States, it is your job, it's your responsibility, I believe, to try to change the focus a little bit from the individual racism down to the systems. Okay, and that involves also a shift of not so much individualism, but more of a focus on the common good and on societal. A reminder so when your students grow up, and hopefully they understand that success is due to all four of those factors, right? Not just those individual factors, but also societal factors and just random luck, right? And they should understand that if they see a current event, of course, it's not going to be the George Floyd uprising anymore. It's going to be something else, right? In 20, 30 years from now, they should be not focusing just on that individual thing, but their mind should say, oh, my teacher taught me that let's go back and look at the root causes. Let's go back and look at the bottom of the iceberg. Let's look at not just the individual things going on, the individual actors in George Floyd, that bad policeman, but let's look at some of the societal factors that might also have contributed to combination, right? So again, this is a call for us to focus on that bottom of that iceberg. So for again, first we tried to dismantle racism by banning explicit and intentional racist bias. Now we're trying to do it by educating away implicit racist bias. However, the teaching people to be anti-racist doesn't necessarily address the structure of racism itself. One of our ongoing societal challenges will be figuring out ways to move beyond individual education and address the root issues of inequality and our role in upholding them. Even all the studies show that even people who have had, even the most woke people who have had all the education and they're determined to be racially anti-racist. Not only are they not actually doing anything to change structural racism, but they're actually contributing to it. A lot of times because they don't know. Sometimes because sometimes because they don't know, and sometimes because those economic incentives are too hard. So this is a quote from Catherine Hagerman's, the sociologist Hagerman's book, White Kids. Many white parents identified as specifically anti-racist and were determined to teach to their kids to work against bigotry and inequality. So this is the equivalent of students and families in our classrooms that we've done a perfect job of teaching about bias and privilege. These are parents that have the Black Lives Matter signs on on their doorsteps, right? These are the ones that use all the correct vocabulary and talk about their whiteness and talk about white supremacy, right? These are the so-called success cases, right, of most bias workshops. Yet, all these families in their own ways are participating in the reproduction of racial inequality. Children were sent to private school, or when they went to public school, benefited from private tutors or enrichment classes. The spectacle of well-intentioned people working half unconsciously to solidify and perpetuate their own power is not an encouraging one. When you have a lot of wealth alongside this racial privilege, they're ultimately making decisions that benefit their own kids, and I don't know how you really interrupt that. And one of the ways is to teaching about structural racism, okay? Rather than individual racism. Okay, so next, and these four overlap. So you'll learn, I'll be deepening your understanding. So the next one way to do that is to distinguish between empirical versus policy questions about racism. So we often, our anti-racism curriculum and programming often focuses on individual versus structural racism. And to be very honest, when we do that, we often impose liberal beliefs about race-related policy opinion issues. As a result, some white students feel personally accused and judged, resulting in defensiveness, resulting in an inability to learn. Some may even push back or rebel. And some conservative students may feel that ideological liberal beliefs are being imposed on them, that conservative beliefs are not welcome. So to solve this problem, Hess and McAvoy recommend a distinction between empirical versus policy questions. So empirical questions have a single right or wrong answer that can be discovered through scientific study. And empirical questions are considered settled when there's broad-based agreement on that answer among credible experts in the field. Hess and McAvoy teach that it is inauthentic and problematic to treat a settled empirical question as open, meaning to allow debate on it. On the other hand, policy questions are open, debatable, ideological opinion questions discussed without a right or wrong answer. People may disagree. And notice that some settled empirical questions are still considered controversial by some. So these are examples of settled empirical questions. There is a preponderance of evidence suggesting one answer. The vast majority of experts agree on the conclusion, but they're still considered controversial by some, but we still don't discuss them. They're still not up to debate. Just because a few people some groups consider them controversial, that does not mean we allow debate on them. Once the social scientists have agreed on an answer, then it's led to bed. So did the Holocaust take place? Is climate change occurring? Are vaccines safe? Is the coronavirus pandemic real? And does structural racism exist? That is a settled empirical question. And just because some people think it's controversial doesn't make it less settled and empirical. There's tons and tons and tons of evidence on it. I have a workshop on it if you're interested. So does structural racism exist is a settled empirical question. It is a fact, okay? However, what, if anything, should the government do about structural racism? We're talking affirmative action, reparations, defunding the police. Those are open policy questions. Those are up to debate. And even if we have, as educators, even if we have personal views on them, very strong personal views, they still need to be presented as objective, and you need to welcome views across the ideological view on that, because that is an opinion and that's going to depend on a person's ideology. There's no right or wrong answer to that. So the notice, because some people, there's always going to, at least in high school, there's going to be some kids in the classroom that pull up a dozen studies that show otherwise, that structural racism doesn't exist. So I want to point out that the burden of proof in science consists of a preponderance of evidence and a consensus among the majority of credible, relevant scholars and experts. It doesn't have to be universal. You'd be hard pressed to find universal agreement on any issue, even science, even hardcore science. So a challenge to this type of scientific consensus is considered an extraordinary claim, and scientific protocols require extraordinary evidence of that claim, not just 6 random studies. So what happens when you do this, when you set up this difference between this, when you distinguish between policy versus empirical questions, it sets up guardrails in the classroom, right? Because, but also notice that the belief in that structural racism doesn't exist is not an inherently conservative ideological position. There's nothing about that, right? But preference for relatively more versus relatively less government intervention in social issues is definitely an authentic ideological difference, right? Liberals, that's the whole definition of liberal versus conservative. Liberals want more government intervention and conservatives want less. So that's legit, right? But the structural racism doesn't exist. That is not a legit conservative position. So when you don't allow arguments that structural racism doesn't exist, that prevents like 99% of the racism that could typically occurs in a classroom, Okay, maybe 95, depending on the area. But most racism that enters, most racist student comments that enter the classroom come from students claiming that structural racism doesn't exist, and then claiming that racial disparities are instead due to inherent Black inferiority, right? So, but you can't say that Blacks are genetically inferior anymore. So you say that we have cultural racism, right? The belief that Blacks are culturally inferior. So by putting on these guardrails, you prevent both non-Blacks from students from saying racist things, and you also prevent the conservative students from being called racist, which are the two things that are going to shut down a classroom and bring in the parents, right? So that and that allows you to welcome conservative viewpoints on discussions on race related policy questions, what government should do about structural racism, and helps all political viewers feel welcome and allows productive civic discourse, basically once you have stripped the racism away from that. So that's distinguishing between empirical versus policy questions. Next, I'm going to talk about you need to teach about structural racism. And of course, that's challenging for elementary school students on the level, but let me at least show you the theory of it, right? So even at the high school level, most US history classes only teach about racism with respect to slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement. Think back on your US history class. I am pretty sure Blacks were only mentioned in those 4 eras, all right? Maybe some of the more, progressive, more better US history classes might mention in passing. They're not going to be like an entire unit, but, maybe a paragraph or 2 on convict leasing and debt peonage, the race massacres and redlining, maybe mentioned in passing, right? But it's actually the more recent history of racism that has the most enduring impact on contemporary racial disparities that allow us to understand, like when we want to understand George Floyd, when we want to understand racial disparities today, when we want to understand police brutality, all that stuff from slavery, Jim Crow, Civil War, Reconstruction, it's like slightly related, but not as strongly as these other eras in our history of US history that I have that are in that darker red. These have a much more stronger and direct and explicit impact on today. And even those, not only that, but it's also important to help students explicitly analyze the impact of history on contemporary racial disparities instead of just teaching them in isolation. I don't know about you, but I was taught historical events in isolation. I'm embarrassed to admit this to you, but I thought we were just supposed to memorize these things from the past. I hated history actually when I was growing up. It took me like 10 years while I was like watching the news and I was like, wait a second, this connects back. It's like history is not separate from today. I was like, wait a second, and then I realized that that's what learning history is useful for. It's useful helping us to understand today because of these repeating patterns and because of these present day legacies on today. And that's very much true for historical and also economic inequity. It's like you cannot understand the racial wealth gap, residential school segregation, all that without understanding these more recent it's really the more recent parts of history. And unfortunately, and oftentimes we never even get to this more recent part. We focus on that old part. So instead of teaching historical developments in isolation, give students the opportunity to analyze the relationship of history to contemporary issues and provide them with opportunities to practice applying historical understandings to better understand novel or new, contemporary issues. Don't let them be like me and take them, 10 years out of college to make the connection. You should be giving them opportunities to see how, of course, on the baby level, right? But they should be practicing from elementary school level. They should have the understanding that history connects to today and that you can pull on your history to help you understand today. But they need practice at that, right? First, you need to help them realize that there is a connection, and then you need to help them have practice, of course, on a scaffolded level. And so that's the history, and now the economics. So they need to understand, and this might be not just for history, this might actually be able, you might be able to introduce this into the classroom for them to understand these maps are very good for understanding inequity, and maps are accessible to kids at a very young age. So I think maybe by the 5th or 6th grade, they should be able to understand a map with your help. And this allows them they can't access data, but I find that kids at a very young age can access quantitative issues through maps. So for example, this is racial segregation in Cincinnati and Cleveland, right? So I think even a young child with some help can start to understand structural racism, to understand that racism is not just individual bias, but you can, and through these maps. Also, the socioeconomic segregation or income level segregation, and political or ideological segregation, allowing them to see these patterns and connecting it with today, like understanding how history affects this segregation, these residential and school patterns, and how that affects today. Another way to do that besides maps, maybe field trips, right? Or try to find different ways throughout the year that you can help introduce them to the not just inequities, but just the differences, the societal factors. Okay, and then last, I'm going to talk about perspectives, consciousness, the cultural worldview. And this also this goes back to that. Remember we talked about in the beginning of our, I didn't introduce this term yet, but some social scientists are starting to refer to toxic individualism. There's an argument that individualism has become so extreme in the last 3 decades, that it's actually to the level of toxic individualism. And that also helps explain why, despite how powerful a nation we are, despite how wealthy we are, we were one of the countries that was hit worse with the pandemic. We were one of the worst prepared. We had one of the worst responses. We had some of the most resistance to not just vaccines, but to wearing masks. It's because of this toxic individualism. We no longer care about the common good, about others, about society. We only care, it's all about me, 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 me. So toxic individualism. So it's your job to help, try to help push us back a little bit towards more in the middle, right? That balance between individual rights and the common good. Try to get a little bit, individualism is great in many ways. Like it helps us become, that's one of the reasons why our country has so much innovation, right? And entrepreneurship. So it's good in some ways, but we can see with COVID, our response to COVID, our response to racism, our response to economic inequity, we can see that individualism has its benefits, but it also has its disadvantages in other situations, right? So one way we can help combat that, to try to reduce that toxic individualism, bring it back to a more healthy levels, is through perspectives consciousness. And you can start developing this at a very young age. In fact, I argue that kids who live in more than one subculture, for kids who have parents from different races or ethnicities or nationalities, or kids that go back and forth between 2 different cultures, they develop this perspectives consciousness from age 2 or 3. For example, I come from a very mixed background. I'm a cultural border crosser. So I basically taught my students how to think like me. And so let's go. So one way the way we do this is we teach students to see not just issues, but the world as conflicting perspectives reflective of our different identities, geography, and experiences. The technical term for this is positionality. So a perspectives conscious approach to cross-cultural communication, just dealing with others, and also to understand current issues, is our recognition that our different viewpoints are the products of our distinct cultures, values, beliefs, and identities, as well, that's what the term positionality means, as well as our different lived experiences in segregated schools and neighborhoods, because you saw those maps. And those maps, that's of Cincinnati and Cleveland, and that's pretty much what all our cities look like in the United States. So we will only be able to understand current issues or others when we seek to understand the perspectives of other people instead of universalizing our personal perspectives. Like just because, for example, after the George Floyd, some people living in wealthy white neighborhoods said, no, there's no such thing as police brutality. Police are good. And all the police that I see are good and helpful, and they don't engage in in brutality. But of course, that's you're universalizing your personal experiences. But the police may act very different in another neighborhood, in a low income neighborhood or in a Black neighborhood. You can't assume that your reality in your segregated neighborhood is universal to the whole country. I have another example of this in my personal life. My father is white and my mother's Black. So they met each other during the Civil Rights Movement and got married in 1965 before Loving v. Virginia. So you can imagine. So my mother moved into my father's apartment, and it was just down the street from where my grandparents, my father's parents used to live. And they experienced a lot of hate phone calls. So they would get phone calls and death threats through phone calls and hang up because of my mother had moved in. In the old days, in order to have that number, they needed to have known, they knew who they needed to be neighbors, and they knew they were neighbors who knew them. So when my mother mentioned this to my white grandmother, she said, "Oh no, that's impossible. I lived there for 20 years. They're so nice. Everyone there's so nice and so non-racist." This is an example of positionality. If she's white, how would she know whether they're racist or not, right? She's not going to observe racism, right? So this is what happens when you don't have a perspectives consciousness, and this is why it's so important to have this consciousness. So perspectives taken is when you listen to somebody else's perspective. It's not exactly the same as empathy. Okay, that's important. So the problem is that because remember that bias, our tendency to have bias is so strong and so instinctive. So we have trouble empathizing with the other. So perspectives taken is sort of a cognitive type of empathy. It's usually dangerous to use emotional empathy with outgroups because they're so different from us. So empathetic concern is an emotional form of empathy, while perspective taking is a more cognitive form of empathy. So we don't try to relate personally to their feelings of sympathy, but we just try to understand why they're feeling. In my classroom, I would say, you don't even have to agree with others. So I said, you don't have to agree with them. You just need to understand what they believe and why. That's all, okay? So the way I did this is through you may be familiar with the parable of the blind man and the elephant. In ancient times, a king ordered all his blind subjects to be assembled and divided into groups. The groups were taken to an elephant, and each group was introduced to a different part of the animal. Those who made contact with the head described the elephant as a water pot. Those who felt the ears defined it as a fan. Those who touched the legs said it was a tree, and those who felt a tusk thought it was a peg. The groups then fell into arguing amongst themselves, each insisting that their version was correct and all others were wrong. It was only when they listened to each other's perspectives and built on them that they were able to construct the whole picture and see the elephants. So I would actually simulate this on the very first day. Every single year, the very first day, I would simulate this. So I would get 3 volunteer students, blindfold them, and then I found this old bear sculpture in the art room, and I put a part of the elephant, of that bear a sculpture into their hands, and they had to describe the shape, just like the elephant. And then, of course, they disagreed. But then after that, I also showed them those maps. I showed them those maps of that you saw, right? With for me, it was Washington, D.C., but racial segregation and economic segregation and political segregation in D.C. And I said, so what does that have to do with the elephant? And then they thought about it for a little while. And then finally they're like, oh my God, not only are we touching different parts of the elephant, but we live on different parts of the elephant. And they're like, the elephant is Washington, D.C. or America. And I put the poster of the blind man and the elephant, just that part on the bottom right, and I put it on the wall. And we referred to it the entire year. So each time the kids started to universalize their own perspective, like think of the world or issues just from their perspective, the other kids would admonish them and say, remember the elephant, or sometimes they would get confused and say, remember the bear, because that was the sculpture I had. And that helped the kids, it's trying to balance that toxic individualism that we have, to think about that that to understand that the world is, we got to think about the way others are seeing the world. Okay, so we have finished, and let's see. Oh, it's 10:45. Okay. Let's see. Hold on, I missed a few things. I also talked a little bit about. I realized I have a few more seconds, so I thought of it as this. I never had a debate in class, so I discouraged debating. I encouraged deliberation. So deliberation means, again, that you're listening to the other side, to the other perspectives, and you don't have to agree with them, but you have to understand why they feel that way. And also together, you have to come up with a solution, a compromise solution that promotes the common good, right? Not just me, but how are we going to fix this, right? So, and that's something else you can start fostering from a young age, right? Even in the elementary classrooms. Oftentimes in schools, we teach debating skills. We teach winning, right? Competing, the right. Again, it goes back to that individualism, that toxic individualism. It's all about winning. It's all about being right and proving the other person wrong, right? And we teach these skills, we foster these skills from a very young age. That's not very helpful, especially at we've gotten to this point where, I'm not even going to put on a mask for you, but even if you're sick, because it's my rights, right? And I'm right and you're wrong. We have the Congress that's a completely polarized Congress, a polarized government, polarized country that is, our democracy is falling apart. What we need to teach kids how to take other people's perspectives, understand where they're coming from, come to compromises, and collaborate, seek common understanding. Again, this is once you have set aside, once you have, you establish that structural racism is a fact, and that's not up to debate, right? But this is for everything else. Other issues, you teach that you foster a whole mindset of concern for others, and considering the validity of others' beliefs, collaboration and common understanding. And actually, you elementary school teachers are better at that than our high school teachers. We somehow lose this by the high school levels. But our democracy really depends on this. It's not just racial equity, it's not just economic equity, but really our democracy really depends on this. Okay, so here are some, we have lots of times to discuss. So I want to, you can ask some questions, and also which ideas and strategies felt affirming to you, meaning they're consistent with what you already do or knew or felt. And which of these strategies or activities would enhance or strengthen your current curriculum or pedagogy. And also remember that these same principles and approaches can also be used to address other types of structural inequities. I focused more on structural racism, but of course you can, you should be also addressing all kinds of inequity, including, I forgot to put it there, but also rural inequity. And in fact, if you teach in an area with poor rural whites, you should address those inequities first before you always address the inequities of the kids in your classroom first before you address other inequities. So I'll open up to questions, but also I would like some maybe quiet time to, if you have the time, to start thinking about how you could do this in the classroom, because you guys are the experts, right? You guys are you are the elementary school teachers, and you're aware of the standards and the requirements and the conditions in situations in your classroom, how would you implement some of these principles into your classroom? And we can talk about, you can share them and we can talk about them. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Okay, why don't we do an activity? Why doesn't everybody has access to the chat? So I want you to write down some of your thoughts. I want everybody to enter some of their thoughts, some of the things. Again, you can possibly think about some of the prompts, some of the things that that felt affirming or consistent. Maybe some things that, some things new. What are some things you're excited about? You don't have to write about all this, but I'm just giving you some potential prompts. What are some things that that were illuminating or interesting to you, or useful, and what are some first thoughts about how and if you could implement this, and maybe any questions. So I'll shut up and give everybody a few minutes to talk, and then you can all send it through chat. Okay, I'm not sure if everybody has a chance to answer, but it sounds like the blind man and the elephant went over very well. I'm glad to see that it looks like you could implement that on an elementary school level, and it sounds like also it is consistent with what you already teach, sort of an evolution, or just an strengthening that and tweaking it a little bit. So that's great. It's always good to find strategies that are not like completely life-changing, like turn the classroom upside down, but rather it's just a tweak or massaging of what you already do. So that's exciting. And as an art teacher, I might make the sculpture to use. That's a great idea. And you can share them with others. So let's talk about some of the other ideas I introduced. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to share my screen again. So the four things we looked at were the perspectives, consciousness, and you can see, hopefully you can see that all four of these, they're not completely separate. Hopefully you can see that they're all overlapping and reinforcing, right? So the perspectives, that elephant, Blyman, the elephant, that also helps to achieve all of this, right? Well, at least it helps achieve the policy part, right? Remember the distinguishing between empirical versus policy questions. So the perspectives consciousness helps with the understanding of the policy questions. What about, I'm gonna push you a little bit, encourage you, let's think a little bit hard. It sounds like it's going to be a little bit more of a stretch for you guys, but let's think of some ideas of how we can start in the elementary classroom, giving kids an idea of structural racism versus individual racism. And I know that's really challenging given their developmental level, but let's see if we can brainstorm between all of us and try to figure it out. So for example, I showed the maps, right? And I'm wondering if we could get a field trip to go in. What are some ideas that people have about how we could start sharing about the distinction between individual versus structural racism? So this chart. Anybody have any ideas? Okay, I'm going to volunteer somebody. Bridget, you shared something with me the other day. Can you share?
Yeah, so one kind of project that I have done is we do an investigation of toy stores and how are toys organized in stores. And they're all organized generally by gender. And sometimes in a toy store, it even says like girls' toys, boys' toys. And so it helps them to see, like, oh, as an individual, I'm a girl and I love Legos, but that's over in the boys section. And so they can see that there's different ways to organize toys, and we could change that structure so that it's more inclusive. And then the other thing I was just thinking of as you were asking that question is the kind of the way that we establish rules. So when we make our kind of classroom rules, those are sort of the structural pieces. That's going to govern everyone. But as an individual, like there might be another rule I have for myself or that I have at home. And so they can see that distinction between like a broader set of rules and then my own individual sort of what I value or what rules I might have for myself or at home. So those are two things that I was just thinking of that might be at a developmentally appropriate level. I did that toy store one with first graders.
Good. I wonder if it's possible to also to look at different schools in the area. That might also be more accessible because kids are focused on schools, to investigate other schools in the area, and they can see different demographics, race, ethnicity, income level, geography, urban, rural, just factors that are more, on the kids level that would appeal to them, that they would notice. But just to get an idea of, and this is also a little bit like the blind man and the elephant, right? So that an understanding that your reality is not necessarily the reality of the different parts of elephant in terms of not just because we want to, it's not just that different kids in the classroom may have different perspectives, but again, that idea that there's maybe very different neighborhoods with very different neighborhood conditions, societal conditions, like structural conditions, so to get them an idea of that, of different conditions in different schools and different neighborhoods. Anybody have any ideas how you could do that? I don't know if this helps. This is more economic inequity, but one of my, I remember one time when my mind was blown and I was quite young. I was in a supermarket with my mom, and she had taught me that that the buying in bulk is more efficient, from money wise, because you pay less per unit. And so I saw these tiny little boxes, the individual use of soap powder, detergent, and I was proud of my new knowledge. So I said, oh, who would buy these tiny individual, clearly it's a waste of money. And, oh, they don't know what I know. And my mother said, sometimes people don't have the money to buy the big container. They're so poor, they need to wash their clothes then. And that's the only thing they can afford. So they have to buy the individual ones. And yes, it comes out to more money. So they actually are spending more money on detergent than we are. That was a face slap for me. It rocked my world. And it really helped me. There was like a domino of, it just completely blew my mind of, everything that I assumed. And it just made me think of a lot of things. So it's sort of like that elephant, the blind man and elephant, but on a more structural level. Go ahead. You're muted.
I feel like that too with art supplies. I taught at Woodlawn Elementary before, and now I'm long-term sub at Mason Elementary. And I wish that my students at Mason Elementary, my art students there, could see how much they have art supplies wise versus how little, I should say, there is at Woodlawn. And I bought so much stuff myself when I taught there, just so that the students could have, the same experiences that like I know my daughters were having at their school. Like I went into that building and there was like not a lot of stuff. And so I bought a bunch of stuff, but I wish that my students could see that.
That's a great idea. And I'm going to push you a little bit. We want to make sure, because the tendency is for kids to say, my individual family is privileged and blessed, and these other individual kids are not, and I'm going to feel shame or myself or guilt, or I'm going to pity these kids, and the response is for me individually to give, to donate or give charity to these kids that I feel bad about. So we want to try to move, that's the tendency. We want to try to push the kids beyond that, because that's not very helpful. We want to try to push into more structural reasons of why that is. So you might push into, that might help you push into, for instance, school fund differences in school funding. And I don't know if you guys know, but 45% of school funding comes from local property taxes. So we don't really have a public school system. We have a quasi-private public school system, because the more money you have, the better quality public education you have. And so the quality of education is strongly correlated with your income and your race, and all that goes back to historical segregation. Like those maps that I showed you, those aren't coincidence. And those aren't present day. And it's not just because people are living with people they want to live with. And it's not even just because of wealth or what you can afford. Those maps look very similar to the old redlining maps back in the 1930s when discrimination was still legal. So of course, it's much too much for kids, but if you can identify one or two of those factors and try to get it away from, because even when kids see those differences, then they immediately go to, me individually, my family, and that individual family, and it's still like individualized, right? Even if you're not blaming the victim, instead of blaming the victim, you're feeling sorry for them. That's not very helpful either, right? So we want to try to, once they get there, then push them a step further and say, but why, right? It's not just because of blessings and I don't think it's helpful either to just say it's because we're white and they're black. You go further than that, right? So start to, and you don't have to explore all those, but again, like maybe you might identify one, maybe the school funding or the segregation, or pick one, anyone that you think that you feel comfortable with, or that you have resources to teach or fit into your unit. With all these things, try to push them a little bit further into finding out the why, right? And get them away from just rich. Yes, there's differences, rich, poor, black, white, but the why is the important thing, right? Does that help?
Yeah. The why, but then do you also think like, what can we do? Like, how can we problem solve? Right?
Yep. That can be that can help. That's help a lot. So one thing is perspective taken. So I went over quickly with that one because it's hard to do, but ideally, if you have a set of opportunities for kids to talk across difference as equals. Lots of times we have opportunities for wealthier kids to interact with less fortunate kids. It's oftentimes through community service, through charity. That reinforces stereotypes and it doesn't do anything about. You should try to have them, it should be as equals. So for example, they could just be talking with each other, or they can be together. It could be a community service project, but the two of them are working together to solve on community problems that affect everybody.
Right.
Game changer.
Right.
Game changer, rather than, oh, let's go visit these poor black kids and give them art supplies.
Right.
We want to stay away from that, right? But
right.
what can let's work together, even if it's working on a project in the poor neighborhood, but it's both sets of kids together. We're going to go, even if it's simple as, I don't know, painting a fence or picking up trash, or I don't care, but you have the kids working together on a common goal.
Right. I love that.
Yeah, that reinforces the empathy and gives them opportunities to build bonds, and as equals. That's really important. And then let's see, another way. Oh, somebody has raised their hand and I don't know who that is. Or was that you? Oh, it's Sarah Gleason. Okay, give me just 1 second. And then trying to think of another way they could work on inequities is what grade they could do art that addresses some of these structural inequities, right?
Yeah.
And you could even have them just do icebergs, just to give them you could have them do icebergs, and then of problems, and then the roots of them. Like even for example, let's say I would stay away from poverty. That's too big and broad, but something specific like homelessness, or more specific, or I don't know, whatever issues there are in the area, but put that at the top of the iceberg and have them draw, instead of words like I used, have them do drawings of the root causes. And so they can, so when they're adults and there's a problem of, for instance, homelessness, they don't immediately think, lock them all up, get rid of them, right? The answer is a homeless shelter and police and locking them up. No, let's go back and find out why are they, oh, it turns out that we're not addressing mental illness. Oh, it turns out that there's no jobs in the area. Oh, okay, that's obviously a more complex, that's on an adult level. But again, start training them from little kids to not just see above the surface, but they should start looking for what's below the surface that's leading to the whys, those root causes, right? What are the roots of the tree? Or if you prefer the roots of the tree rather than the iceberg image. But lots of times as adults, as voters, we just vote for laws that just get rid of the problem, get rid of the manifestation of the problem, right? But don't address the root causes. All this helps with equity, right? And I'm sorry about that, Sarah. Whoops, did she have to, oh no, did Sarah leave?
No, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm in New Mexico and we have a very, very large poor population. And through this, like how, I don't want to say that you're discouraging community service, but that's a huge thing that we work on here is serving others and the rights and responsibilities we have toward one another. So I just want to make sure that I'm putting the right, correct, positive spin on community service when we take lots of field trips to work in food banks. So how would you suggest, like, what words would I want to use to not create there's already disparity.
So, yeah, the partnerships in community service, again, if you just have the kids working together, so any project, a community service project that has huge inequities in power, that has, like I remember in my private school, we had, it was wealthy white kids mostly. And then in addition, they had the wealthy white high school students going into low-income elementary school kids. So adding the age difference in addition to the race and ethnicity and class, and teaching them. It just reinforces stereotypes and on both ends. And all the research, I can provide you with tons of research to do that. So what you need, you can still do community service, but as equal partners to try to have more similar levels of power in everything, except to try to minimize those at least. So have same age kids, for example, working together. And again, an easy way to do it is have them work together as a team at addressing that problem. But when you have charity, just plain charity and plain community service from it, is a position of power and wealth.
Well, see, I don't think it's a position of power because I work at a Title I school. We are a poor school, but we still do community service, and we talk about how it helps our families and it helps our own community.
Yeah, then that's perfect. But okay. Again, but let me just be clear. Are they, because they can also be inequity, are they helping out kids that are even poor, or are they helping their own community? You gave me the impression that it was from wealthy communities to
no, it's our own community.
Yeah, that's not a problem then. It's only community. It's not community service per se. It's only when community service is between or charity is between two groups, is from a group of a huge, much more power and privilege than the other group, and it's only
I understand better now.
Right? It's only one direction from it's what do they call it? I've forgotten the term, but I am privileged, so I allow you help, right? So so it should not. It's that differentials in power and privilege that becomes a problem, that you reinforce those. And also, even if even within it, I would not only do community service, or even if you do community service, then that can be an opportunity, again, just like the art teacher, to push into why are there these, why are we forced to address these? Why do these problems exist, social problems exist in the first place? What are the root causes of these inequities?
Right.
So give that, have that, build that in, weave that into that project. Is not just we're going to address the tip of the iceberg, but let's explore the roots of that tree, or that the bottom of that iceberg.
All right, thank you.
I apologize for not understanding you.
That's okay.
Anybody else? No? Come on. Okay, tell me something, something that interested you, you would like to do, but you're not sure how to do it. Anybody? And then we can, as a group, we can problem solve it. Or nope. Okay, what about something you disagreed with? Nope. Julia, do you think everybody, do you have anything else to add, or do you have any prompts? You know this group better than I do.
Actually, I'm Daphne, and I am sitting in for Julie.
Okay.
So I have not had the opportunity to meet this group before. Sue, my supervisor, has. But I thought that this was a great presentation. It needed to be shared. I think the climate that we're in today, perhaps I don't feel as though it's the issues are not new. I think some people are just maybe not becoming aware of it, but some people are feeling more convicted of it, perhaps. So I just thank you for bringing this to the teachers, the front of their minds, and perhaps that it can be taught to the children in an elementary level. And I do appreciate the ideal of having people of power trying to do things for people, other people, is not equal. And I appreciate you bringing that out. I'm from a low income background, and I remember, people, white students coming to my school and trying to do things for me, older white students coming to my school, trying to help us, and how I felt. So I did not feel good about that situation at all. So that was a great idea. So thank you for bringing that up. So, but I have nothing else to say. If no one else has anything to say, I would like us to thank our presenter today. Tell us again, how can we get in touch with you, and perhaps put it into the chat?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, and I'm happy to continue discussing with anybody, and help problem solve, or come up with lessons.
Yes. And to answer the question, I say, are we giving CEUs? Yes, we are. We're giving CEUs for this. When you register, we have all your information. And I'm looking at the attendance. we will make sure that it is sent out to those who have attended. So I do have a question about attendance. Our teacher Kemper, what was your first name again? I'm sorry.
Christina,
Christina. That's with a C or K.
C.
And then I have Pam. Is Pam still on the line?
My last name is Fox.
Fax?
Fox, F-O-X.
Okay.
Why don't you stop the recording?
Okay. Thank you. So so before I stop, let's give a round of applause to our presenter. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.
Okay, and can you also send me the recording?
Yes.
Appreciate it.